Working Cows Podcast, episode 226.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. This is Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows Podcast, powered by the Global Ag Network. Very excited to be joined today by Sage Askin. Sage runs Askin Land and Livestock along with his wife Faith, and they're doing some really neat things over quite a wide area. Could talk to Sage about a variety of subjects. He had a great episode with Brian Alexander on the Ranching Reboot podcast. I would encourage you to go out and find that for a little bit of background on their operation. But we're going to drill down today and focus on one specific practice that they have been making use of there on their operation. We're going to look at using Peruvian herders today. And of course, this will specifically relate to sheep. But I think that the sheep are maybe an underutilized opportunity for people looking to get started in the first generation. So real excited to be joined finally by Sage. Been on the list for a long time. Really good guy. Really looking forward to this conversation. Sage, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Clay.
I should clear up that I'm like a cat. I've said this before. I don't know if I've said it on the podcast, but I've said it before. I'm like a cat with a laser pointer when it comes to this podcast. Like, I'll interview one guest and they'll mention somebody else and I'll go track them down, or I'll be scrolling through Twitter and I'll find somebody. And so you've been on the list for a long time, but it's good to finally get you on to chat a little bit.
Well, I'm deeply honored by that, Clay. I think you've interviewed some top-notch folks. So, like I said on Brian's, you're getting to the bottom of the barrel, but it's very generous of you to think I have something to share, and I'm delighted to be a part of it, Clay. Yeah. So, thank you.
No, absolutely not. You're great. So, I'm excited about this conversation. And what I invited you here to talk about is using sheep herders. There are a few that I know, some in northwest Wyoming, some just across the river in eastern South Dakota, and then you are the one. And then I guess there's some in north of Billings that I know that use herders. And it's a pretty, seems like everybody that uses it, once they start using herders, they continue with it. And so it must be working pretty well for the people that get started with it. So can you talk to me a little bit about your history with the herders? Have sheep been a part of, Askin Land and Livestock going all along, or are sheep a new thing and the herders came along with that? So how'd that history kind of play out?
That's perfect. Well, we started, I had a little ranch up on the Wind River that I leased for 2 years, and that's northwest of Riverton, Wyoming. And it had a lot of brushy river bottom land that I didn't feel like was being very well utilized. And so being new and I'm kind of one of this newer generation like you, I think, are, Clay, that has one foot that's in this new progressive era of ranching, or whatever you want to call it. Hopefully progressing. And anyway, for something I'd heard a lot about. My mom and dad had about 50 sheep growing up, and I spent plenty of time in the lambing barn with that little set. So I knew a little bit about small ruminants. So it wasn't like a discomfort, but I was a range guy. And so I decided that I wanted to get some sheep because the range there, I thought, had some browse that the sheep could better utilize. And I didn't really think of the goats at the time for whatever reason. I just wanted to roll into sheep. So that was in the fall of 2014. And first we got sheep and we just managed them on that ranch. And we tried hair sheep to fill out the load of wool sheep that I bought. I bought 66 hair sheep ewes and I really liked them. And so we just continued down that road. And the reason we got into herders, Clay, was because the little boogers wouldn't stay on the place. So we're fenced for cattle, and we tried the single strand of hot wire down at the bottom around. And I know a ton of things that I was doing wrong. thinking there was still feed there that would make them content. And I think that I was lacking that. Anyway, but there was really appetizing alfalfa across the road and stuff like that. So after about a month of running around chasing the sheep, we said, all right, let's get a herder who can help us do this. And then where my mind goes, I tend to take things times 10 to my detriment often. And so pretty quickly thereafter, I leased a sheep range in the Gas Hills of Wyoming. And it was a great big 120,000 acre BLM allotment. And before I knew it, I'd signed up for doubling the sheep herd and kind of just rolling on down that path. So we were pot committed for about 6 months before we had a herder. And we kind of needed one. So, so that's kind of how we got to that. So.
Sure. So you didn't grow up with sheep then, is that right?
Yeah. Mom had what I would call a farm flock, Clay. So I did grow up. I actually had some dairy goats that I showed extensively in 4-H and FFA. But as far as the big open range sheep deal, no, that was always something kind of neat. You know, I'd drive through a sheep ranch. Grandpa had sheep on his family ranch, you know, and I just heard stories, but I did not grow up around sheep. Had no clue what I was doing at scale. I don't know why I jumped to 300 right away. But we did. So
sure. Gotcha. Well, you're making my mouth water. I've got two nannies due any day, and I can't wait to have goat milk in the fridge again. And some people probably think I'm crazy for saying that, but I prefer it to cow's milk as long as there isn't a buck around. My anecdotal research says that as long as there's no buck around, goat milk tastes better than cow's milk. But if there's a buck around, you might as well just lick that buck between the ears, because that's what it's going to taste like.
They are the stinkiest little boogers, or big boogers. Yes, sir.
But anyways, back on track, back to the point of our conversation today. So you, at what scale does having a herder work? The number that I keep hearing from different people is about 1,000 ewes. Is that right, to a herder, or is it a 1,000 sheep where you get some pairs and some triplets or whatever, or some twins? What scale makes herders work?
You bet. I like that number, Clay. I wish it was less. So when we started in 2014, you could get a herder, and I'll go over all that, I'm sure, on this, but you could get a herder for $750 a month. And so at that time, I was selling lambs for like $100. And it still was, I thought the bare minimum was 2 loads of sheep, was kind of how my mind worked, if that makes sense. So we had that first load, basically 300 ewes, and we kind of said, well, we need 600, ewes to justify doing this herder. And even then, it was pretty bare bones. I would say that if you do that, it just doesn't leave much margin for error. And a guy wants to go ahead and add, a guy or gal wants to go ahead and add that third load, so 1,000-ish, I'd say 900 to 1,050 is kind of where you get that. But now the prices have went up by 250% for the herders. Wow. So, and so have lambs, right? So now, will lambs always stay this high? I really doubt it, So it's kind of funny how things have changed over just a few, 8 years now that we've had herders. But I still think, that 900 mark is probably where you start noticing some real efficiencies. I would say, though, Clay, you're able to get these herders, and we've went through some different things of getting them to do extra stuff. And so if they're not completely supported by the sheep, and they can do some fence fixing and some different stuff, I think there's some ways there that they can add value at a smaller flock size, if that makes sense. And also, if you're doing some acceleration on your lambing, which we haven't done, but I think there's several different avenues where you can make it work with less. But for the typical pure range, open range, sheep herding, old style deal, definitely 3 loads of sheep is where I'm at.
So what's driven that increase in the market for sheep herders? Is it competition, or is there something else that's affecting that market?
Like a lot of things, it's I hate to blame the government, but it's government regulation, bureaucracy. Without getting too much in the weeds, I don't know all the weeds, but there was kind of some undercover sheep herders who more or less said that they weren't getting fair treatment, which I'm sure there's always a hint of truth behind that. I don't know anything about it specifically. It starts bumping up in California first, and then it moves on to other states. And Wyoming's kind of one of the last holdouts at our low rate, which is 1,700. Just got upped. Now we're in 2027 is what I was told for this year. And so you're told what to pay them by the federal government if they're on the H-2A visa program. I have no clue what people who employ illegals pay them, but I don't know if it's commensurate or not. So it's probably more. So, but we chose to stay all legal on it,
right.
And we have to date. So,
right. Regulations tend to create black markets. You don't have to worry about blaming the government. My philosophy is that the government's deal is I'm here from the government and I'm here to ruin your life by fixing a problem you didn't know you had. I'm sorry, that was negative. But
my Christmas presents every year is like, what are we going to pay him next year? I really can't budget. And it jumped by that first jump. It jumped by about $1,000, Clay.
Wow.
I mean, it was a big chunk. So
do you have to deal with any of those visa issues then?
So yes. And what they are is they're here on an H-2A permit, and it's a specific to ag workers. It encompasses basically the H-2A has 3 different types of permits. And those are, they had a sheep herder one, and it was very unique. It was a 3-year deal where they could be here up to 3 years, and that's abnormal. Most of the worker permits, I mean H1B, H2A, they're like a seasonal type thing, and I know a lot of people, for example, like in high school who did like a summer in France, or whatever, and that was very similar. It was just an exchange type program. So they have those. But for ag workers and specifically to sheep herders, they decided that they'd make them an exemption where they could be here for 3 years. Well, just a year ago, they killed that. And so now we can still keep our guys here. They're legally here on their work visa for up to 3 years, 36 months in a row. But we have to stagger permits a period. So they can't be here on any one contract for more than 10 months, as complex as that might sound. So we run back-to-back contracts. They have a 2-month, basically what we call like a lambing contract for the months of May and June. And then the rest of the year, they're here on like a sheep care contract. But as one will, when they take something away from you, you can maybe find a loophole and take something back. And so they killed the sheep herder permit. I think the intent could have been to kill Western open range sheep herding. So we just kind of found a way around it with those 2 back-to-back permits, but that doubled the amount of applications. We do it all through a immigration service, and there's half a dozen across the West. I'm sure there's a few more back East, I've never even met our lady other than we've talked on the phone. She's phenomenal. We have had excellent service. She does all the recruiting. She actually employs a recruiter in Peru who goes and vets these guys. And it's been pretty successful. I mean, I would say about an 85% success rate on guys that she vets. A lot of the ones that we've picked off of Facebook or whatever, which I've done a little of, have been flops. So I totally trust what she's done for us, and anyway, we pay for her services. It's a lot of pass-through expense to the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Labor within our state here in Wyoming. You're required to have workers' compensation, which once you have it for them, you're required to have it for all your employees. And so it does lead to a lot of paperwork. But the first one's the hardest, the bulk of that paperwork, Clay. And then after that, a lot of it's, kind of the same. But they come and inspect your camps. We've been audited by the Department of Labor. They come for every 3 years for camp and on-site inspections. And there's a lot to it. I'm not saying all that to dissuade anybody, but just to prepare.
Yeah. So. Yep. The realities of the situation. It is kind of I would say an opportunity that is unique to the West in your experience or your exposure to other areas of American ranching, and maybe other places in the world too. But do you know of anybody maybe even east of that 100th meridian that's doing this with herders?
Not really. Certainly not traditionally. A few ranching for profit oriented folks, I think, have employed herders who I've met and talked to. But but it's certainly not in the culture. You know, they tend to have, you know, just less overall. I think this is all correlated. You know, they have way better fences there because they're fencing in way less land. They could probably afford to fence better. And so our little hair sheep that, you know, nothing, it's like trying to hold water, it feels like, or goats that we've operated with. They have fences generally that I think hold them. So anyway, that's just my impression. So
no, I think you're right. I had never heard of it, but I knew that you were probably exposed to more people using these techniques than I was. So I thought maybe on outside chance you might have heard of somebody that was using it out there.
Yeah, there's a handful of goat herders, and there's also some targeted grazers, Clay.
Yep.
And they have their guys herding, but they're building fence. So they like fence them in it, and this is very prevalent in California. We've sold animals to those folks, and then also on the East Coast. You know, and so that's just a different means of herding, which essentially their result area would be livestock control, really, is one of their key results areas. And so it's just a different means of doing it. So the herding fits out west, you know, our sparse landscapes and kind of the methodology behind sheep, maybe getting them on poor range, areas that are less well watered, you know, trying to stack them with cattle and create a symbiosis. I think that's where herding really applies out here. So.
Sure. You know, and you talk about targeted grazing. When I went through the High Plains Ranch Practicum, the first table group I sat at, they did it a little differently than the Ranching for Profit does. You're not assigned to the same table all week. You could sit kind of wherever you wanted any day. But the first table I ended up sitting at, I was sitting with a guy who I think they were running 5,000 ewes or something like that, and they had a herder. They had herders for kind of each band. I would guess 1,000 each herder, basically. And he said that they will ship them to that targeted grazing, and he said generally it's free. Sometimes I get paid for grazing leafy spurge projects, and so I mean that's an opportunity that probably doesn't exist unless you've got a herder there to walk with them and keep them on that targeted grazing, whatever you're targeting.
Right. Yeah, that's a really neat business. And we've studied it and done just a little. I've done half a dozen projects, maybe, Clay. All of mine has been like what you're talking about, a leafy spurge type thing. And I would consider those like extensive targeted grazing, where there's scattered plants up and down, and you have to have that on-site control. And then there's kind of intensive ones, which are more like brush control. And they do that in California, where you physically fence them in, and you actually get performance loss on the animals because you're trying to just scorch whatever's within that, you know, enclosure. And so that's kind of the two different types of targeted grazing. Obviously the intensive one is what pays. Those guys are making, you know, literally over $1,000 solidly in 4 figures per acre to clean up land that's very high value land. The extensive, it's, you know, I think it's pretty typical for it to be out west where it's free grazing for your animals. I did a Canada thistle project in Montana, and then a leafy spurge project. Well, both of those we got basically discount grazing. They weren't free, but it wasn't probably at full market value. Just helping the rancher. And in some instances, I think after like fire mitigation and stuff, the BLM has employed targeted grazers to come in and help with those projects. You know, so we've done a little of that, but it's all been extensive, and we've never really made any money at it, but we've probably got discounted rates on our grass for our animals. So we're still dependent on the income from that, the lamb crop, you know, and the production animal, which I'm not sure that that's not two different ends of a teeter-totter. I'm not sure that these small, you know, I'm not sure that you can do targeted grazing and get production. You know, you might be, it might be a balancing act. So.
Right. You're going to sacrifice some animal performance is what you're saying.
I am. Absolutely. Chad Peterson, really brilliant mob grazer. He's up and I'll never forget what he told me. He was in my Ranching for Profit class, and he made this statement. So I want to repeat it. And he said he was talking about goats, and he said that the value in goats is nothing to do with their reproduction. It's 100% in their browsing ability. And that's always stuck with me. I think that's probably at least partially true with sheep, but it's definitely true with goats. And if I were going to start a big goat operation, I think I would lean towards doing it with at least a month or 2 months worth of targeted service grazing per year to help that thing cash flow. So
before we move off into some, animal performance, ecology, cow symbiosis, some of those things, I do think there's some more here to talk about as far as the herders themselves. And I've been very intentional, and maybe some of the language I've used in this episode so far hasn't reflected that. But I've been very intentional to talk about it as working with herders rather than using herders, because I think that that's an important distinction to make. But what I really wanted to talk to you about right now is what is communication like? How does that work? Did you have to learn some Spanish? There's, especially in a system where you're trying to keep an eye on, range utilization and some of those things, I would imagine that there's some level of communication that has to happen with those herders to make sure that things are, the way you want them to be, or maybe it's just their culture that things get used the way that is best for the land. So how does communication work?
Absolutely. The herders are amazing people. I would akin it to this, or liken it to this, Clay. Just think about it from a real broad angle. They're people that are willing to go, 5,000 miles across the globe to work somewhere to literally build their family's house back home. Think about the foresight. So they are not there. They might be some of the most intelligent and just awesome, logical people that I've ever met. And so that's 100%. You're right. There's no use of herders. It's utilizing the services, and working with these men. And we have nothing but respect for every one of them that we've ever had, even the ones that didn't work out. They've still been really neat guys. So that was a roundabout way to say communication is everything, because there's still people, like Alan said, every problem's a people problem. Every problem we've ever had with our herders has been definitely a communication problem. And so when I first started, this is kind of funny. I remember meeting the one in the Casper airport, and he flew in and his name was Angel. Well, I didn't know that. It's spelled Angel. So I was like, "Hey, Angel." I had no idea who I was talking to, but he figured it out. And then I knew I'd memorized it right there off of my Google Translate, which I did have the presence of mind to download. And I'd memorized "Bienvenido a los Estados Unidos," which is welcome to the United States. And that was great. Like, he was like, "Oh, gracias." And I kind of got that. And then he said a bunch of other stuff, and I had no clue what he was saying. and all he wanted to do was to call his family and let them know that they'd arrived. And I had no idea what he was saying. And so for about 2 years, I was terrible. And I should have done a lot more foresight. And thankfully, they have some cool things now, like Duolingo. I think there's one called Babbel. And I think either of those is a nice little app for just conversational. I do emphasize conversational Spanish, but I also emphasize immersion. I've picked up now where I can, I have had a few dreams in Spanish, and I can converse with them, not like super technical stuff, not off ranch per se. Like if they're wanting to tell me about their daughter's party back in school down there, I have a really hard time with some of that. But as far as ranch Spanish and stuff, just through immersion, I've picked up enough where I can have a phone conversations with them. And what I can't, I just have learned to say, like, I don't quite know what you mean. And then we jump to Google Translate, and it has, just in my little tenure of about 8 years, it's moved to being a really good program where you can actually hold, it does everything. It does text, like on words, on paper. You can actually hold your phone over and it'll just convert it. And I've used that like at menus at restaurants and stuff, like ordering for those guys, and just say, "Hey, here, use it like that." And you can also speak into it and it'll spit it out. And then if you're really desperate, you need to get it really accurate. You're not quite understanding, they just type it in exactly, and then it spits it out in the right language. So that, with the tools that are at hand, I find there to be very little excuse for not picking it up. If you're wanting to use this labor route, and really work with these guys, Google Translate, and then doing a little bit of that conversational Spanish on the side, I think you'll pick it up in a year or less. So
sure. Sure. Yeah, the Babel app scares me a little because I've read the Bible and I know how that story ended. So no, I'm just kidding.
That's identical to me. I haven't even opened the Babel app because I'm like, oh, this doesn't sound right. But Duolingo, I downloaded that one, so it's probably fine. I don't know.
Yeah. No, it just struck me. Any other issues as far as acquisition, communication, some of those things? We're going to move into some more animal performance and animal care things, and how you guys are seeing that work out with the herders. But working with the herders specifically, are there any major nuggets or things that we've left on the table before we move on to talking a little bit more about animals and ecology related to herders?
Yes. I would just say that, you can't really interview these guys or get any real insight on that. And it's kind of a two-way thing. When you get them, you're kind of in contract with them as much as they are with you. And your recourse, of course, is to send them home. But right now, the lag time on it is a solid 8 months from initially saying, I think I want a herder to getting one, getting somebody over here who can help you. And that is a long time to plan ahead. So I guess there's been men who have shown up who we've made the best out of the situation, Clay. And we've just learned to work with them. There's been, and I think in a nutshell, what I've learned is you really have to work with them on a personal basis. So you might get a guy and he gets really bored herding sheep, and because he's really into other things, and some of those guys, we found that they're really, they can be a valuable asset. They might have mechanical skills, or they might know how to weld, or they might know how to be really good at fixing fence. And we've actually just gained enough prowess in our herders that we try to fit them in and fill them out as a person, just like any other person. And the reason I'm saying that, it sounds pretty commonplace, but I think a lot of people that would get these guys would not do that, and I know I didn't right off the bat. I don't know what it was, but I just thought, well, they're here to herd sheep. But I've learned that they're a person, and you really have to fill them out like you would any other person, and really try to fit them in where they fit best on the ranch. So we have guys now that we're actually working with them on beef cattle, and we have two men who are very experienced at moving cattle within our intensive management system and fixing all that stuff. And we've actually changed their contract so that they are able to do that. So I did want to add that just because I thought it's really important, yeah. So
yeah, well, those countries. I mean, I got follow-up questions now, which is great. But those countries that those guys are coming from, they fix problems in those countries with their minds, and that is in contrast to us, where we, especially in American ranching in the West, agriculture in America, we fix problems generally with hydraulics and horsepower. They fix problems with their mind, and they're incredible people. That the things that they can accomplish with snatch blocks and pulleys and ropes and ramps and wheelbarrows, and I mean, just the things that they get done are awesome. And so, giving them some latitude to be able to think and express that ingenuity, I think, is a very important piece of this.
Absolutely. And the other thing. Oh, I'm still here. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Here, Clay, is this any better?
No. It was just a network blink is all we had. We had a network blink there. So
I'm sorry about that. Nope. I think, anyway, I did hear your question, and all I wanted to add, or not really question, your comment, all I wanted to add is that these gentlemen, they sometimes they'll fix something up and it's not quite what you wanted. Like they'll be perfectly content with the battery terminal on their four-wheeler having to, just hold it there to start it every day. And it's kind of funny because you're like, oh, I wish I would have known about that before you completely shredded the whole terminal, And so there is the most important part of all of it is, and I think this is a bigger deal for ranchers. I don't think that we're super in tuned with animals in America, and probably less so the younger generations, than ever before. And so these guys they're still in a third world country. Almost all of them still have, chickens and goats and sheep in their backyard. And they raise their own food back home, and they do gardening, and they're just incredible people. And something about them, they're way more natural at just taking over a set of livestock. Not everyone, because they still have their, some of them are still mechanics, not animal husbands, but something about that where they're more attuned, they grasp it quicker, on a ranch, and that they just do better with the animals than some perfectly willing Americans who've done it all their lives. And that's the truth. It might include me. So, yeah.
Yeah. And that is a great segue, but I said I had a follow-up question. I do want to cover that. Mm-hmm. You said that these guys, get bored herding sheep. Do they all come from a sheep herding background? I mean, is this a family generations long deal, or is it just something that maybe they've had a tangential connection to and awareness of its practice in their own country? But this is an opportunity to make some serious money and build a house back home. What is their exposure to sheep herding before they show up?
Right. Very little. All the ranches in Peru. Can you hear me there?
Yeah. No, I was just saying, wow, I wouldn't have expected that.
Yeah. All the ranches in Peru are not, I don't know what they are, to be honest. They're big corporate deals or government owned things or something. Like it's messed up. So very few of these guys have done any more than like their uncles, but they all remember like their grandpa having a little piece of land and running a band of sheep. So that's kind of cool. So, I've had one out of, I think, 11 men who've worked for us who had any livestock background beyond the typical garden or farm variety. And the rest of them have all had to learn, you will occasionally get guys who've already been to the States, and those are kind of cool. Especially with COVID, they've become really hard to come by because they're a little more experienced and they can jump right in. And so there's a ton of competition for those guys amongst people who utilize men from Peru. And so keeping them occupied. The younger guys, the older guys seem to be really less digital, just like Americans, and more attuned even more than to animals. The younger guys are super techie, but I'll catch YouTube videos of how to like nutritionally manage sheep better, and that's kind of cool. And so anyway, it's just kind of, yeah.
We might get to animal performance, animal care, cow symbiosis, but there's some more here that you've mentioned too that I think we should cover for sure. I've talked to people who have used herders and have ended up sending or losing them to visa issues. And then they had to let the sheep go because, they, like you said, trying to keep water in, they couldn't keep them in. They were having issues. How have you managed that, so to speak, passing the baton from one to the next and some of those things? And if you lost your herders, would the sheep go?
Yeah. Oh, it's a great question, Clay. Yes, we find it a weak link in our business currently that if we lost all the herders, we would have no real good way to do it other than herd ourselves. And that just, I'm bad at it. There's no other way to put it. I'm too distracted and I'm on the phone talking to people like you and stuff. And the sheep wander away. So passing the baton, once again, it's easier once you get your first guy. I would say that's another reason to get to scale where, so even for one band of sheep, if you have 1,000, for example, you'll still want 3 or 4 people there during lambing season. And what that did is it drove us to say, well, if we can do one herd of sheep, then let's do another herd of sheep, and maybe let's do a third herd of sheep, and then we can have 4 herders, maybe a 5th like alternate, and then and so this thing scales kind of rapidly, and that is a big deal because they can team up for that lambing season, and then they can all split back off and kind of get their solace out there by themselves, and that seems to be the thing that really kicked us into overdrive with our herders. And as far as passing the baton,
it's just like you'd imagine, the older, more experienced herders, you kind of put a young guy with them and try to train for a week or two before they have to leave, so we really try to control that. But I do have, I don't know if you want me to go into that. I have one really cool story on a herder running off, and probably a couple. And anyway, if you want me to delve into that, I will.
Fire away.
Okay, cool. So the first couple of herders we got were spread out. I don't know if you know where Elk Mountain, Wyoming is.
Yes, sir.
But it's in far southern Wyoming, right up against, Colorado kind of on the map. And then we had another guy still over there in the Wind River, kind of off the Wind River there in the Gas Hills by Riverton. So there's about 4 hours between those two sites at full speed limit. So they were a long ways apart. And I was managing those two guys while living at Lusk, which is another point of the triangle. So
4 hours east, right?
Yeah, 4 hours of the other direction.
Right.
So to make the circle was an all-day deal. You left in the dark and came back in the dark, even on summer solstice. So, and so I was down there, and my dad was actually with this guy, and I talked with him, and his name was Rolly, and he was a great guy. He did a good enough job with the sheep. And we had just visited him, and he didn't really seem happy. I got to be honest. And I could kind of tell, and we dropped a horse off there. That was a better horse for him than the one he'd been riding. And we kind of thought things were solved, and he tried telling me some things. And I probably, looking back, didn't really listen well enough. And long story short, 2 days later, I got a call from the ranch owner, and we were working with the ranch down there doing an elk mitigation project. And the ranch said, the neighbors called and said that they found that horse all the way across their pasture, all by himself, or they think they see a horse, and your sheep herd is pretty spread out. And so I of course jumped in and was just headed down there. Now we generally check on those guys. You're required to have somebody checking on them twice a week, Clay, by law. And so we typically do that with the ranch owner. They're just supposed to do this little bit of observation. And then we actually do an on-site, about every 14 days, and when it's functioning properly. We bring them supplies and spend a night there and so on and so forth. Well, so we had no plans on coming back. This had only been a couple days since we'd last been there. But anyway, so I made the flying leap for down there, and I sent Dad also, and Dad actually got there first. And he calls me on the phone, and I'm still in route. And he says, I can't find him. And the sheep are literally everywhere. They're all across a mountain, And so we were like, well, I don't know what's going on. And we started kind of comparing notes. And in a nutshell, when we got there, it still looked pretty lived in. Like his last meal was on the stove. The horse was gone. We couldn't actually find the horse. We just heard a rumor that they'd seen the horse. And so we kind of thought this guy might be hurt or injured or something, and so I was literally, I'd called search and rescue, the sheriff's office there in that county. And we were trying to, we were right on the line of making a major effort. And I finally came to my senses after talking to the lady who helped us get these. And she said, go in his camper and really do a deep clean for personal effects, And so his suitcase was there and everything. But I never would have opened it, anybody's personal possessions. And so I hadn't dug into it yet. Well, I opened it and it's just open. It was too big for him to take along with whoever picked him up. So, it was a bit of piecing things together, but we discerned that he'd taken off, and the only clues we had to go on, it was about 18 hours of panic, but the only real clues we had were that, he'd taken some of his personal possessions. He'd left some behind, and the horse had been unsaddled. He left the horse all right. So long story short, we had quite a scale. And what we learned, Clay, is this: there are companies in the country here in the States. There are dairies, especially, are really bad about this. Dairies pay people to bring herders to work for them, and they do run illegals. And so there's this huge underground network of dairies in this country. And I think they're great people. They're just using the resources they have. And so I certainly don't blame the people at the dairies. But it sure hurts a guy like me to have my herder run off because I would call it coyoting. These people will show up wherever in the country for $500, and they have to pay them in cash, and they'll drive you to a dairy where you then get employment, often at much higher wages than what we're allowed by the government to pay them. So that's kind of the situation there. I think it's only fair that people kind of know that. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yep.
So you mentioned some of the practical sides of this, and I'd kind of like to start moving in the direction of some of these,
Cool.
ecological benefits, just making that segue of talking about the practicalities of it. I've interviewed guys who actually lived in sheep wagons when they were kids. Spud Lemmel talked about that on his episode of the Working Cows podcast. Do you, what are they living in? What are some of the practical things like that? Are they're with the sheep 24/7, 365 through the winter, all those things? Talk to me about some of the practical sides of actually housing and keeping these guys fed and warm and all those things.
Absolutely. Yeah. So our guys live in campers. You can or could get a pretty reasonable camper for like $1,000 up till this past year about. And they're nothing I wouldn't stay in,
Right.
And have many times. I originally was going to do a sheep wagon route, but those have become like a collector's thing now. And so for like a sheep wagon with a hole in the roof, I often joke it's, a rig now. so we still don't own a sheep wagon, although I kind of aspire to, just someday. So the sheep wagons, actually, there's new companies that are putting those together, and they cost in the $25,000 to $30,000 range. And they're amazing. They have solar panels and all sorts of stuff. We just aren't that well funded, yet. So we don't have those. Our guys stay in campers. We have kind of winter camps and summer camps. We kind of merge that with the demand for labor. So we send a lot of guys home in the wintertime so we can free up. And then we've generally got all of our campers filled in the summertime is kind of how it goes, Clay. Every camp has a generator now. And they all have like an air compressor, small toolkit. They're expected to kind of do basic stuff. All of our guys generally run with their own four-wheelers. We kind of went away from horses for safety issues. Most of these guys know nothing about horses whatsoever. And certainly not American, hotter blooded horses and stuff like that. So,
Sure.
It was just a lot to keep a horse fed and grained out at these camps. So, we're, I would say 99% four-wheelers and, all the things that come with that at a camp. So,
Sure. So talk to me about the just day-to-day on the ground life of a sheep herder. Where are the sheep? Are the sheep getting penned at night? How are they moving with the sheep and making sure that grazing is happening well? How often are they moving those campers? Talk to me about some of those things.
Fantastic. Yes, we try to pen the sheep all the time, and at night. I mean, and the only exception for that is lambing season. When it's just a little bit harder on their pairing and maternal abilities to be born in a pen of 1,000 sheep, So every night, I guess the sheep herder gets a break, and that's a really big deal for him to get a break like that. Then during the day, in the morning, I would say he gets up, he makes himself breakfast, and kind of observes the behavior of the sheep. They're generally ready to go. There's some mornings when they're super content internally in their ruminants. They might not be wanting to get up off their bed ground till 9. And a lot of days, like especially in the winter right now, when they're a little bit more nutritionally, we're asking a little more out of them. They're dry, or just about to be bred. They kind of need to get up and going at daylight. So, 7 o'clock, the sheep herder's going to let them out. At that time, he does have an opportunity to count them. And many of our guys do. To get an inventory, and some of them don't, they generally can let those sheep go for just a minute, and they'll go in and kind of finish their breakfast, and then they'll go out and kind of what I would call gather control over the herd. Then they will drift them into wherever they're supposed to be herding them for the day, and kind of go from there. So the herding behavior during the day, they're usually allotted within a paddock that we have fenced for cattle, Clay, or within a larger pasture, that's just barbed wire fenced. So of course the sheep don't respect the hot wires. They pass right underneath them. But we can usually give our guys a map and kind of say, hey, stay within this area so we can get some semblance of control. I'm not going to claim that it's perfect. I'm going to say it's like 80% control that we can be sure they're grazing in that area. And we have found the way to, I haven't found the Provenza style of like the nutrition book and some of this amazing stuff. I've really delved into that. And I actually had Dr. Provenza put together a 2-page deal for our herders, and we gave it, to one, and it didn't really go anywhere. I'd love to get them to where they're really thinking through, like different times of the day, when to add protein, when to get them in the brush, different things, but we just aren't there. I haven't found a way to effectively communicate that yet. But what I will say is, midday, those sheep noon all summer long. And nooning is something you're familiar with as a sheepman. But they'll just lay around by the water usually, and that's where they want to be in the middle of the day, and they need to stay and ruminate. During that time, the sheep herder in the summertime can usually get a 3 or 4 hour break and nap. And so he'll come into his camp and kind of lay around there, usually sometimes even lay under his camper and just cool off and hang out. And then they kind of go back out and graze all afternoon. And we try to have them in before dark or right at dark. So that's kind of the life in the day of a sheep herder. We mitigate nutrition on the herd by moving the whole camp. So we try for the night pens, that gets to be a spot of between 1.5 million and 4.5 million pounds of density, which is its own thing. It's incredible what that does. But those spots, we don't want them to be in an area for more than a week. And we try to do it every other day if they'll do it, and it's a little bit of work. So, I'd say we average probably 5 days on a night pen set. And that's proven to be where in our semi-arid range, we'll recover that within a year, unless it's a devastating drought. So, and then let's see. So what my managers generally do who are managing these sheep camps, they will generally, we just tell them, like, those guys aren't going to manage themselves. I think just by force of habit, the sheep herders gravitate back to their camp. So if you really want to control the grazing in an area, you have to move the whole camp to a new area, and so we try to do that about every 2 weeks, somewhat harmoniously with the bringing new supplies to them in a perfect scenario. That's what we'd be doing all the time. So
sure.
Yes, sir.
Very cool. Very good. Practically speaking, I like the way that works. Talk to me a little bit about animal care. Is this the sheep manager and the sheep herder cooperating together to do some animal care, whatever that might be? Maybe the herding means that there's very little animal care where they're actually running down an alleyway or anything like that. Talk to me about some of those things.
Absolutely. Yeah, they're responsible, and we've got this printed up for them now for treating, the two things, pink eye and then kind of foot rot related things. So like limpers and then blinds. And they're responsible for treating those and isolating those animals, very quickly. And they know that their responsibility is to go get water and kind of keep those animals healthy. We don't do a lot of that. Like you just said, the herding does, usually improve their nutrition to where they're on good range. And we haven't had parasites be much of an issue at all. The bigger things are more of like just a typical sheep ranch in some respects. I would say a typical low input sheep ranch. And that is the actual manager who's managing the herders' responsibility. And so, they kind of get the reproductive schedule. They do communicate that to the herders, so they have a general idea of what's going to happen throughout the year. For example, lambing June 5th, more or less, meaning we need to be in our bed ground around a good lambing grounds by, May 31st, because they're going to start popping and stuff like that. So it's definitely a team effort. But in a nutshell, the herders are just there for day-to-day care. If anything does lamb, they are set up with some milk replacer and some other stuff just in case. And then we surge those lambing supplies during lambing season, which is its own kind of thing. So, but the herders are expected to take care of all basic animal husbandry. And I give them one basic tenet, which is that no animal dies out here. And so that isn't perfect. Of course, I'm not trying to claim that it is, but I have found the old deal of sheep are seldom saved, or however you want to put that, that's taught in vet school. I think it's pretty preventable through nutrition generally. I think sheep are just as hardy as the next thing. Mm-hmm. They certainly, suffer from a little more stress than other animals. And that means their immune systems can be, can be compromised at times. So,
Yep. Dave Olala is one of the shining lights in this industry. He's a great guy. He's a sheep man from our neck of the woods. He was an extension sheep specialist for University of South Dakota for a long time. I've interviewed him a couple of times, and just a real great guy. I really like him a lot. And he told me one time that his theory on why sick sheep are not always saved or seldom saved or whatever is that they don't show illness or weakness until they're like dead. They're almost dead before you can tell that they're ill, because they're so susceptible to predators that if they ever showed weakness, they would get picked off right away. And so they don't show weakness until they're really, really sick. And so, and I've seen that to be true. So.
Absolutely. And those guys gain a level of trust with their sheep that exceeds in much of what, you're seeing parts of it with your sheep. I've kind of grown out of it as I've gotten away from the herd itself. But man, those sheep, they let down their guard, and they're catching things and giving them a shot of LA, and, if they need it, and then they're bouncing back in 3 days, whereas me, if I was out there doing it now, the sheep wouldn't trust me. And just like you say, they'd all look fine to me every day. So I agree. I couldn't agree more. What a wise guy.
Yeah. Yep. So let's talk a little bit about some ecology. Where do you find sheep are performing best? What land does the best with sheep? And then how is the grazing kind of handled? What does it look like when they come in? What does it look like when they leave? Some of those things.
Absolutely. Definitely your rougher terrain and poor watered terrain. Sheep, even in the heat of summer, they'll only drink gallons, I think, a day.
Hey, hold on a second. We had a little blink there. How many gallons a day will they drink?
I haven't seen more than 4 gallons of consumption ever, Clay, per animal in the hottest days of the summer with lambs at their side, so it's pretty minor. So that's the big one is, poor water and a lot of the arid West, I think. And that also correlates often with really good country, you know what I mean? Because cattle don't use it very well. And so that's kind of been our secret, is going into country that, it might be a mile, it might be 2 miles to water. And then the other thing is, in the wintertime, those sheep can really get out. Like right now we have 2 inches of snow down. Unless we're feeding them, the sheep won't, as they won't even drink. They won't even go into water, and that's really convenient. So we've ranged on that big BLM range in Western Wyoming. We ranged as far as 4 miles from water with, in the winter, and we were camped that far from water, and it went on just fine. You could tell when their water stress came on, and you did have to react quick, but it was certainly manageable. So I think that's a big asset.
Yeah, oh man, absolutely. I think you've probably mentioned some of these pieces throughout this conversation, and somebody else could probably piece together some of these details. But as I'm trying to think about the next question, sometimes I miss part of what's said. So could you talk to me a little bit about the seasons, how long they're with the sheep? Is the same guy with the sheep 24/7, 365? You said 8 months, I think, at one point. Do they go home and you've got another guy coming in to take that baton at some point? And then, just kind of some of those things. The sheep are out on BLM range now, right? It sounds like through when, or are they there year round? Could you talk about some of the day in, day out practicalities of those scheduling issues?
Absolutely. Yeah. Generally our guys, we do try to keep them here for a full 3, back to back. We send them for vacations. So, by the time at the end of the first 8-month period, he's like in it, he's seen a whole production season. He's seen all that. So, I guess, we're on range 24/7. We have learned with the hair sheep, we barn them in big blizzard events. And the guys know that, so they all have AccuWeather on their phones too, and so they check in and say, hey, this looks like a big blow. Are we going to bring them in, and stuff like that. So, we've just had a couple big events that actually cost us a lot of money. And, we've learned to protect the equity in that respect and not have sheep pile up. But I guess, is that going the direction you wanted to go with that? Or?
Yeah. Just kind of, are they on BLM right now? Is that right?
We're actually all on deeded land right now with all of our sheep. That's just by happenstance.
Sure.
There's a ton of opportunity for young people that in Wyoming. There is, I think it wouldn't be inordinate to say 30,000 head capacity that a person could snap their fingers on vacant permit and have, or pay a very low sublease to somebody to rent it, all across Wyoming, especially Western Wyoming. And I think that extends to all the open range states in the West. So, just because we're not on as we speak doesn't mean that there's not a tremendous opportunity there. So.
I'll stop saying that people should move south and east if they want opportunity in ranching. I'll promise. I won't say it anymore. No, it's good. Yeah. So this is the Working Cows podcast after all. And I want to talk to you in some bonus content about if you've got time, that is, about custom grazing contracts. But for now, you've mentioned ranchers, landowners, and they're all on deeded land right now. These are on land that you don't own right now, right? Is that right? That these sheep are grazing on land that you don't own. Are those generally cattle ranches that they're on, or is it non-operator landowners? What kind of land are you typically on with these sheep?
Yep, it's all cattle ranches, Clay. And we really are kind of, our philosophy is the tenet of, each ranch needs some sheep. I loved what Wally said there, so I can't say it any better than him. So anywhere we release up a cattle ranch, we start thinking, how can we add a small ruminant component to this ranch? So with that, they're not fenced for sheep. They don't have small troughs on these ranches. So we've had to just change everything. But it's pretty minor. The cool thing about sheep is that the cash in, as Wally again alluded to, isn't that much. A couple little sheep tanks, some net fence, and suddenly, and a camper, and you've suddenly got a sheep camp that you can add. I would say that that's our secret weapon. And there's been some bad years where the sheep herds, that's our margin that year. And the hard parts about it are we're in country that's strong, hardcore cattle country, and everybody turns up their nose a little bit at sheep. So there's some things there.
Yep.
So.
Well, and I'm sure there's been times where those guys have been exposed to places that have been nuked by a sheep or by a sheep flock and think, well, I don't want that to see that happen here or whatever, and bad experiences and different things like that. So
absolutely. Every paradigm comes from a kernel of truth, I think. So.
That's a good one. That is a good kernel of truth. But anyways, yeah. So, could you talk to me a little bit about cow symbiosis, how they work, why they work so well underneath a cow, so to speak? Talk to me about some of the timing of when the cows are there, when the sheep are there, what you guys have found works best as far as some of those things and marrying those two herds or flocks or flirds, whatever you want to say.
You bet. Yeah. So they are distinct herds. We have not found a flurd to work, probably just because we're not getting into densities where that actually occurs. And I have found it best to rotate, kind of change it up and when the sheep are a higher value animal. So when the lambs are at their side, the sheep should probably have the best of it. But so during that time, we will run them just through the pastures, just like our cattle, and they'll get a rotation. Generally, we'll top it with cattle because the sheep are, in May and June, they're lambing, generally. And so they're kind of stationary during lambing season, and they are nuking an area. There's no way around it. So I try to select an area that has not had that done before, where that could be beneficial. And then we give that, complete season rest after that experience. And 1,000 ewes might require a couple sections, to lamb on, and it will be gone by the time they're done. But then, so during that time, the rest of the ranch, we might be doing an Ian Innes style graze where we just top it and we take a very small bite, out of all of it. And then we like sheep to come on behind them. Clay, we're generally not commensurate, like our AUM, SAUs, however you want to put it, of our sheep herd is very small, and we might be running a cow herd of like 600 or 700. So it doesn't quite work 1-to-1. It's often like, 4-to-1 as far as the amount of impact from the cattle herd as the sheep herd. So we, time means that we end up not in a perfect deal. It's not staggered like that all around. But the sheep generally we try to bring cattle through first, then we try to bring sheep around, and then the sheep are kind of slower, and then the cattle, where the cattle maybe were in the spring, the sheep spend time on that during dormant season. So a lot of our range we're going through once in the growing season, once in the dormant season. In a nutshell, I would say that's kind of what we're doing. It is intentional. We're trying to break that parasite load. And then in the winter time, so commonly we're running stocker cattle, and they're another high performing animal. And the cool thing is they leave in August, and so we'll run through country in the spring, like in May and June with our stocker cattle. It'll grow up because we didn't bite it very hard. We took like 3 or 4 animal days per acre. And so it'll have, 10 or 15 animal days per acre for us to winter the sheep on. And so we'll just come in there in the winter, and during dormant season, it wouldn't be too uncommon to bring cows along behind those sheep. And I think that's probably a good fit for a lot of ranches. Put your sheep in first. Then again, they're a much higher gross margin per standard animal unit business than any cow in any circumstance, like 10 years out of 10. And so it's just, you just want to spend a little more on their nutrition, and an old cow can clean up a lot and take a lot, so I would say that's kind of the average of what we do. It's very conditional to the ranch or the site, if you'll understand. So,
yeah. Sure. As I sit and daydream about future business models that really get me excited, the future business model that I tend to drift towards is owning a band of ewes, running them with a herder, and then custom grazing yearlings in the growing season. And one of the things that I often think about as a logistical issue that has to be overcome to accomplish that is on which side of those yearlings do the sheep graze, because you're kind of running 2 animals that you want to perform well at the same time. So in your experience, you're telling me that you guys run the yearlings first and then the sheep come through afterwards. Is that right?
That's right, Clay. With an adequate rest in between. And some of the earlier pastures, maybe no cattle touched, if that makes sense, right. But those little lambs, they just grow, and I am pretty convinced on these drought years, people gravitating towards sheep. I think that's going to become pretty common because they still perform pretty well, and where there's just not enough quantity out there for a yearling. These little hair ewes that we're running, they're only 110, 120 pounds. And that makes that conversion even to a yearling, pretty close to 6 to 1. And so it's pretty incredible, how that all works. Also, cattle are a broader snout, and they even your yearlings, who go everywhere, right? And they go up and down the sides of your hills. We don't utilize those hills nearly like a sheep herd who will just go and sit along the topography of the hills. I would say that if a ranch is perfectly level and perfectly flat, and all grass, that's kind of a cattle ranch. But if you have any topography, any forbs, anything like that, I still maintain like the traditional old deal, the 300 cow ranch. I think one of the things that could really make a difference in their budget would be to go to about a 200 cow ranch, run the 200 sheep that they could run in addition, plus replace the other 100 cow units, at an 8 to 1 level, and that would give them a band of 1,000 sheep plus the 200 cows. And I think that would be an awesome outfit for a lot of people. So.
Yep. You're making my mouth water, Sage. That's where I'm at. I sit here in a land of opportunity for that. And another kind of one of those rule of thumbs that I've heard, is that if you can hay it, you should graze it with cows. If you can't hay it, you should graze it with sheep or goats.
Sure. That's probably accurate.
Yeah. So any other major nuggets that we've missed here as far, and I know we've kind of zipped across this animal performance, animal care, cow symbiosis. There's at least an episode probably in each one of those. And let me just say, again, the sheep episodes I do on the Working Cows podcast are always the most popular episodes I do. There is a market for a sheep podcast somewhere if somebody wants to start one. I know there have been others started. Not casting any aspersions on other podcasts that have been started, but there's a market out there if anybody wants to start the Working Sheep podcast. I think it would do well. And anyways, so any other nuggets that we've missed or things that you had on your list that you really wanted to cover today?
I think maybe one of the things with herders specifically is I don't really like it when people think, oh, this is just cheap labor. I tend to think of it as highly skilled labor. And the dollars go out differently. So I'll kind of leave that at that. I think we've explained it well enough. That's just kind of a myth I'd like to dispel. Woolly sheep probably don't require herders nearly to the extent of like goats and hair sheep. I think a person can get by and have a pretty significant sheep component with woolly sheep because they're pretty respectful of fences generally, other than the lambs, but these hair sheep, if you're going to have one, you're really going to want a herder someday. So they just go everywhere.
Do they jump more? Like my wool sheep will go through stuff. They won't jump it. Where like goats will jump things more than sheep will. Is that in your experience with hair sheep as well, that they'll jump more than they will go through?
No, I think it's probably conditioned learned behavior. They just crawl under the barbed wire fences. They'll get down and crawl under, a 3-inch looks pretty tight. It's only 3 inches above the ground, but they'll get in the middle of that wire. And, after 1,000 go through, that wire's broken. and it's just like, come on, guys.
Right. Yep. A couple of things we should do, just kind of cleaning up some pieces. The night pens, is that net fencing?
You can do both. I would recommend the net fencing if you don't have sagebrush. If you have sagebrush, Clay, I recommend metal like panels for fencing. And we have enough. We usually have 20 metal panels at each site. They're a bit cumbersome. Sometimes they get left behind when we're moving quick, and then we'll just go back and get them. That's really convenient because if they have to lock one up, it's really nice. Or if they find like a lamb, which is a really big deal, they'll lock them up in there, which is pretty nice. But the net fencing is something we're going to go back to because I think it just fits so well in your grassed areas. Is incredibly difficult to roll up in the sagebrush is the only thing that's kind of kept us from doing it everywhere. So.
Sure. And the panels you're talking about are maybe like a 40 to 44 inch tall panel with a bottom bar across them, maybe 1.5 inches off the ground and some hog panel welded on them. Is that something about what you're talking about?
That'd be perfect. We get a lot of these that almost look like what I'd call like a county fair panel or something. Those are perfect. And the cool thing about them is, and we've done this all over in, an hour's worth of work, we can collapse, 40 panels into a corral system that allows us to dock or to, sort. And we just have one portable sort gate that we carry around to all of our herds, and we just pump it on the end of a few panels. That's our race, put a bud box behind that, and just boom, we're working sheep, and that's really cool. We're really efficient that way. So.
I would covet the opportunity to come work sheep with you sometime if that would ever be a possibility.
Oh, anytime. Yes, sir.
Well, you just let me know. Give me a couple weeks of notice, and we'll see if we can make it happen. And last thing I wanted to clean up, kind of something I think we glossed over. You said that if you've got a big snowstorm coming in, you will move them. Is that call the trucks, move them in, or are you generally within reach of a barn, a day's walk or something of a barn that they can get in?
You bet. Yeah. So I would put it this way. If you're in higher precip areas that are like good cow ranches, typically they get a lot of snow, like sometimes. And that's what we're in Lusk. If we were out in the deserts that only get big snows, Western Wyoming or whatever, like once in 15 years, I wouldn't worry. That's the math is good enough. You're going to be fine out there, even if you take a hit. But Clay, I have 2 times now one time we lost 1,000 ewes in a blizzard. It's a really sad story. Many people have heard it. I won't go into any, unless you want me to, but those things can happen so quick. Like all those old timer stories you hear and the old books you read, about the sheep herds wadding up and piling up and all that. man, it's all true, and it can happen just out of nowhere. And we had our second little event here this past October, and I'm just devastated by it. And it was a lesser event, but it did end up resulting in the lives lost of over 300 ewes. My gosh, I'm just sick about it still. And so, yeah, we're just kind of gun shy. I think those things can happen if you're in this high blizzard area. And the problem is the sheep drifting. So it's true blizzards that do this, and if they start like they blow out of their bed ground, and that's another risk of the night fencing, the net wire fencing. They could blow it over pretty easily, and then they just kind of drift. And that's when it's danger zone. When sheep are drifting out in a blizzard, you're in trouble. And so we've just kind of learned, it's only 2 or 3 times a year. We try to get them behind at least a windbreak. And I won't go so far to say a barn is necessary everywhere, because it's certainly not. But I can't stand the equity loss anymore. So we try.
Yeah. So. Yeah. Frankly, I don't want to hear those stories. I live in the heart of the Atlas blizzard country, and Lord willing, if this podcast is still going in 2023, we will sit down in October of 2023 with a few ranchers who lived through that Atlas blizzard and talk about the Atlas blizzard 10 years later. That's a heartbreaking story. But I think it's something that should be documented for history, because, just the resiliency of these people, first of all, but it's just tough stuff to talk about. So
yeah, Grandpa told me something, and I'll leave you with this. He said that be prepared to buy your sheep every 5 years. I didn't really know what he meant. and now I kind of know what he means. And a lot of these sheep ranchers who operate with fenced sheep ranches, I think all across your country and north of like Douglas, where I grew up and stuff, they all have these big woven wire fenced ranches and move their sheep around. They all live with that. You just don't hear about it, but that's pretty common to lose 100 in a blizzard, and, but the cool thing is sheep will pick you up and carry you on where a cow herd won't.
Well, Sage, it has been a pleasure. Very, very good, very helpful. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, sir, so much. And you wanted me to stick around, and I have plenty of time. So
okay.
I'm here.
Great. Yep. Great. Very good stuff there with Sage. Really appreciate his perspective and his heart for this industry, and just making himself available to share some of what they've got going on there. Really looking forward to next week's episode. We're going to be talking to Travis Kraus and Freitas Seligson about what they've got going on there at Grazing Lands down near San Antonio, Texas. Got some really neat operational things and perspective on just the future of ranching and those things. So encourage you to come back again real soon for another episode of the Working Cows Podcast.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.
One last thing. Would you prefer working with sheep herders, working with Peruvian herders, working with Basque herders? What do you think would be a good title for this episode?
Maybe working with Peruvian herders. Okay. That sounds fine to me.
Yep. The
Basques all own the ranches.
What's that? Oh, the Basques own the ranches.
Did it long enough ago. They all own the ranches now.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Very cool.